If you'd like to speak to an advisor for sources of support and information about the issues in tonight's film, you can call the BBC Action Line on 08000 839 839. Calls are free and confidential, and lines are open until midnight every day.
Christmas is coming. Romance. Excitement. Expectation. Celebration. Joy.
A celebration of performance starting in Tosca this Christmas on BBC Two.
Newsnight now on BBC Two with Jeremy Paxman.
Tonight, the government tells us how it hopes to fill the gaping hole in the country's pension plans. But will today's announcement do anything to make these people's future any more comfortable?
Look, they are all pigs. They are all enemies of Islam. But those
Tapes that show a London Muslim fanatic preaching violence and death. And Britain readies its army to redeploy in the Gulf. What are the British planning if it comes to war in Iraq? Good evening. You can work longer or you can surrender more of your salary. Otherwise, you're going to have a miserable old age. After years of inquiries, consultations and exhortation, the government announced today what it planned to do about the pensions crisis stalking every household in the land. They decided to have further consultation, another inquiry and more exhortation. They're also graciously allowing people to work longer if they want to. First tonight, Paul Mason on the bleak facts and figures behind today's announcement.
The pension system is falling apart. The basic problem, we're all living longer. There are 11 million pensioners in the UK, and that figure's set to rise. The proportion of those too old or too young to work is rising too. It's 24% now, but it'll be 37% in 30 years' time. And the current mixture of state, company and private pensions just can't bear the load. We're all trapped inside this crumbling pension system. Problem number one is the basic state pension. That's been falling in value ever since it was delinked from earnings in the 1980s. It's £75 a week now for a single person, and that's topped up to 98 with means-tested benefits. Even that only meets 70% of the basic needs of a pensioner, so 1 in 4 live in poverty. And that figure's set to rise because of what's happening with company pensions. About half the workforce has access to company pension schemes. The money's put onto the stock market, but your income in retirement is guaranteed, usually set at 2/3 of your final salary. But it's a system that's eroding fast. Last year, 46 companies closed their final salary pension schemes to new entrants. This year, it was 84 companies. It's all due to falling stock markets and fewer tax breaks. So more and more of us are being forced into private pension provision. And what are the problems with that? Well, usually the employer doesn't put as much money in. You're not insulated against falling stock markets, and there's a double whammy. At the end of it all, you buy an annuity and you live off the interest. But lower interest rates mean lower incomes in retirement. The experts tell us because of the falling value of state pensions, we all have to save more. A 30-year-old man who wants to retire at 65 on an income of £20,000 a year would have to start saving £260 a month. The problem is the vast majority, 18 million people, earn less than 20k. So the problem isn't solved by lumping it all onto private provision. And that's why at the heart of this whole ramshackle system is a £27 billion a year savings gap.
So there's the problem, and today the Work and Pension Secretary Andrew Smith had his chance to offer the government's bold solution.
People living longer is good news, but if people want to see continued rising living standards in retirement, They either have to save more, work longer, or a mixture of both.
So our political correspondent David Grossman listened to the announcement. Did it seem bold to you?
Certainly not in the minds of many pensions experts and indeed trade unionists. The problem that government after government has with being truly bold with pensions, being really radical, is the same reason many of us aren't saving enough for our retirement. The pain of doing that comes now, and the benefits are 20, 30, maybe 40 years down the track. And in politician years, if you like, that is beyond their event horizon. The pain that they would see in perhaps compelling people to pay more into pensions, compelling them to pay to work longer before they receive the state pension, they would be punished, they fear, at the ballot box now, and they won't be around to draw the benefits from that. And in terms of stopping companies closing down their final salary schemes, the problem that Paul identified there, that would mean stepping in to intervene in that market. And the day that many companies get the whiff, the merest whiff that the government's thinking about doing that, will be the day that a lot of them actually choose to close down their final salary schemes before a new law comes in. So that would mean that the government would actually increase a trend that they're seeking to stop.
That's to argue that a government of whatever persuasion might well be inclined to run away from this problem. Is there any sign, though, that Tony Blair himself wanted something bolder than we actually got today?
Well, a lot of those analysts who identify the frictions at the heart of government suggest that there is this big friction between Tony Blair, who wants to be bold, wants to be radical, wants to redesign the whole pension system, and the Chancellor, Gordon Brown. The Chancellor's approach to poverty, and pensioner poverty in particular, has been to introduce a minimum income guarantee. And what that actually does, it means that it's very difficult for a lot of pensioners, a lot of today's workers, in fact, to save enough to mean that they'll be taken out of these means-tested benefits by the time they retire. Now, the government is bringing in new proposals, new measures next year, the pensioners' tax credit, to try and alleviate that. But critics still say that the disincentive to save is still all too present.
David, thank you. Well, had the government taken the opportunity to be bold, our economics correspondent Stephanie Flanders explains what it might have done to stop the pensions problem in its tracks.
As one tax accountant quipped, "If this is radical, then my name's Leon Trotsky." After much delay and many leaks, Andrew Smith delivered about as much as expected today, but a lot less than many had asked for.
Some employers have been reducing their financial commitments and contribution to workplace pensions, causing anxiety and damaging confidence in pension provision. There's a difficult balance to strike here. We want to increase member protection without imposing burdens on employers.
Members of the Allied Steel and Wire Pensions Group learned the drawbacks of the current system the hard way this year when their company went into receivership, and people who'd been contributing to a pension for many years saw their benefits more or less evaporate. They didn't see much in the minister's statement for them.
When you put your money into an occupational pension scheme, we were not informed of any risk. In fact, we were actively encouraged to do so and reassured by governments and experts that this was the finest thing you could possibly do for saving for a retirement. That's what we have done, and we have lost our money. We feel robbed. We've been Maxwelled without Maxwell, and he has not addressed that issue.
My concern is there is too much talk and not enough action. My other concern is in the area of scheme wind-ups. The government has recognised that employers ought to stand by their pension promises to a greater extent than now, but they are in effect giving notice to employers that they're going to tighten up in this area, and some employers might read that as a message to close the schemes down now rather than hang on and wait for the cost to escalate.
Mr. Smith couldn't announce more dramatic action on the employer side because he knows there's a limit to what you can make companies sign up to in a world in which they have the option of deciding not to offer a pension at all. If you really want to force employers' hands, you have to introduce compulsory savings for pensions on both the employer and the employee side. And that was the biggest step the minister didn't want to take today.
There are some who believe that a radical strengthening of the voluntarist approach to pension provision can never be made to work, and that the UK should move beyond it, for example, adopting further compulsory pension contributions.
Some people may think that, but Mr. Smith isn't one of them, or not yet anyway.
I think the Minister has been alarmingly complacent about the size of the problem, and he's ducked the biggest public policy issue, that is compulsion. He's talked about what the state is going to do to protect itself from risk. He's talked about what employers can do to protect themselves from risk. He's talked about the private sector and their role in all of this. What he hasn't done is looked at it from the point of view of the individual who's expected to save for their own retirement.
Mr. Smith is betting that public education and a judicious amount of scare tactics will be enough to make these young people save more. He's probably also worried about the political cost of forcing people on low incomes to save when they can hardly scrape by as it is.
I think that on the present nurse's salary, I think that saving for a pension will be one of the lowest priorities I have. I think affording rent, affording food, affording travel, I think pensions aren't even in my mind at the moment.
Maybe they should address the more fundamental issue of why the state pension isn't good enough at the moment, as opposed to just forcing people to pay money, especially since it's going to go to private companies as well.
In effect, the government's been left telling people to save because it's not going to save for them. As Mr. Smith pointed out, Britain now has one of the cheapest public pension systems in Europe. Trouble is, with expanded means testing of benefits, if and when people do save more, there's a growing chance that they're going to be penalised for building up that saving when it comes time for them to retire. The government could have solved that problem today by replacing the current tangle of pension benefits with a single, non-means tested state pension that's higher than the current one. He chose not to.
Instead, because of our targeted approach, projections show that public spending on pensions in this country will remain stable over the next 50 years at around 5% of GDP. It is this same targeted approach, Mr. Speaker, that has enabled us to meet the second challenge, that of pensioner poverty.
He's essentially left the relationship between the basic state pension and the pension credit unchanged, and that implies that over time you'll end up with a growing number of pensioners actually facing means testing at that level. That is, in a sense, inevitable if the government's aim is to focus help on those on relatively low incomes. Of course, whether those people on low incomes are actually getting the help depends as much on take-up as on the formal rules of the system.
Though they penalise savings, complicated means tests don't seem to be a very efficient way of getting money to the poor. Up to a third of pensioners on low incomes today don't manage to claim all the benefits they're entitled to.
We need a far simpler benefits regime for pensioners and to reverse the spread of means-tested benefits. So why won't the Secretary of State recognise this problem and do something about it?
No one expected Santa. But Mr. Smith today did pass up the chance to announce a fundamental rethink of the state pension system with opposition support. And on compulsion, he held out the possibility that he might actually change his mind in a few years if he turns out to be wrong. Not so much an opportunity missed then, but certainly a decision delayed.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Pensions Minister, Andrew Smith, and asked him how much more people should or would be saving as a result of today's announced changes.
It's a judgment, Jeremy, which people have to make for themselves. It's one of the reasons we're making available clearer information, simplifying radically the tax system and giving people more choices about how long they continue working. At the end of the day, I don't think the state can dictate to people what the total level of savings should be. We do have an obligation to get the framework right and to allow people to make the balance between saving and working longer, which is right for them.
Why have you ducked compulsion?
On compulsion, what we say is that we're strengthening the voluntaristic system, which has actually been a great strength of British pension provision. We're monitoring it, and if we needed to go further in the light of advice and trends on long-term saving, then we would. But, you know, it's something of a last resort.
My question was why you had ducked compulsion.
We haven't ducked it. As I say, I've set up a commission to monitor the trends on long-term saving, the effects which our proposals have. You see, Pensions provision is a partnership. Government has to get the framework right, but it's up to employers, it's up to individuals, it's up to the financial services industry. And what we're doing is monitoring how far everyone is meeting their responsibilities. And if it is necessary to go further with compulsion, then that's a road that we would have to look at.
How many more inquiries do you need?
It's not a question of more inquiries, Jeremy.
Well, how many have you had so far?
Well, it's right when we're bringing forward what are radical, wide-ranging, and in many respects tough proposals that we consult people before they're implemented. And if I weren't, you'd be asking me, why aren't you even discussing this with employers or trade unions or the public before you do it?
No, I'm not. I wasn't suggesting that at all. I was just going to remind you of the words of your great leader. We're at our best when we're at our most radical.
And isn't sweeping away the whole tax system which we've inherited on pension contributions, removing...
Not in the opinion of people who know about this business. They say it's like rearranging the paper clips.
Let me answer the question. Removing 8 tax regimes into one new, simple, straightforward regime, dramatically simplifying the whole basis of the contracting out system, removing compulsory retirement ages. This is radical.
As a consequence of these radical, you call them, plans you've announced today, what incentive is there for any employer to improve his occupational scheme?
Because we're slashing red tape, dramatically simplifying the tax system, and we believe that it will save those who are operating schemes and employers who are contributing some 150 to 200 million pounds a year. That's a very considerable incentive for people to offer good schemes.
Just as a matter of interest, I mean, your own pension scheme are based on a 40th of salary, which is a great deal more generous than most occupational pension schemes. Is that the sort of model you would advocate every employer offering?
It is a good pension scheme, and what hasn't had the attention perhaps it should have done is that when MPs voted for it, they also voted to increase our contributions, which go up by 50%. But look, it is a generous scheme, Jeremy, and I think all of those of us who are on good pensions, I think it gives us a particular responsibility to get a strengthened system in place with better provision for those who don't enjoy the same security in retirement.
Andrew Smith, thank you. Well, we're joined now here in the studio by Steve Webb of the Liberal Democrats and David Willits, Andrew Smith's Conservative shadow. What was the biggest thing he failed to do today, David Willits?
I think he failed to tackle the problem of the state benefit system and the interaction between all those means tests that Stephanie Flanders was describing and the private system. Because if people are afraid that if they do save, they'll just lose benefits pound for pound, it really does undermine the incentive to save, and he should have tackled that.
Well, there's no incentive to save when you know that you'll be bailed out with a means-tested benefit anyway.
Well, that's part of it, but what we want to see, and oddly enough, Steve Webb and I worked together on this, what we proposed, when the government last brought forward proposals for extension of the means test and the new pension credit, the Conservative opposition and the Liberal Democrats and Frank Field, the former Labour minister, we all said instead that money should go into a higher rate of pension for older pensioners. That way it was still well targeted on poverty, but you weren't extending the means test, so you didn't have this problem of why save made even worse.
Steve Webb, what about this question of compulsion, which appears to have been fended off to yet another inquiry?
I think really that is ultimately the only way to make sure enough people are doing enough saving. That decision's really been put off by a decade now, because we're going to have a few years of consultation, legislation. This commission will want to spend 5 years seeing how it's bedded down. They'll eventually decide there's not enough saving going on. But all this time is being lost, and a whole generation of people are going to be retiring with not enough money.
What do you think?
I don't believe in compulsion myself. I mean, I think one of the reasons is it's very difficult to compel people to save at the moment if you don't change the rest of the system. Is it really right to take a guy earning £15,000 a year, maybe with a credit card debt as well as a mortgage, and say you're obliged to save, even if that means that you're no better off when you retire? And also, I know it's the Liberal Democratic policy to compel people. I think it's rather illiberal. I prefer to have policies that work on incentives rather than policies that compel people to do things.
What is your argument in favour of compelling people?
I think that the freedom to retire in penury is not one I value a great deal.
You may not value it, others may make that choice.
They may make that choice, but I think people tend to be very short-sighted inevitably about saving decisions. And if they don't realise that the state is pulling back quite dramatically, people have assumed in the past that the state pension would be a bedrock, and it's falling away all the time.
You would both have to concede, wouldn't you, that he has at least simplified a lot of the tax arrangements?
I think that the future tax system could be better, yes. It does look as if he's made some progress there. He's keeping the old arrangements, so we're still going to need all the regulations because they'll cover the contributions we've already made. For them, the old tax regime will apply. But it looks as if potentially he has made progress on the tax system, yes. We'll want to check whether Gordon Brown hasn't smuggled in some stealth taxes, but provided he hasn't, then this looks like a useful reform.
You praise that too, I take it.
I think some of the tax changes look quite promising. I think the biggest problem is the delay in all of this. People are having their pension schemes closed now, are losing their savings now, and it's going to be years before we see any real change, and that's the failure to tackle the problem.
If there were, I'm saving both your presences, as things look at present, you are not going to win the next election. If there ever was an opportunity for a government to take a long-term view about a long-term problem, this was it. Do you feel that this government has risen to that challenge, David Willis?
I'm afraid I don't think it has. We have had yet another consultation exercise, but we haven't had the prospect of a really bold look at a different approach to state benefits. And I've made it clear that people need a long-term basis for planning their pensions, and we in the Conservative Party would work with the government if they did come forward with bold proposals that made sense.
Another thing that would be probably unpopular would be raising the age at which you can get the state retirement pension. Are you and the Lib Dems in favour of that too?
No. What we'd like to see is enabling a lot of people who don't even get to work until they're in the late 50s or early 60s, get rid of some of the barriers, the discrimination and the things that stop them working even to those ages. What we'd like to see is the pension much higher at later ages. But I think to say to people you can't get anything even at 65, you'd have to wait until you're 70, is actually not necessary. What we want to do is focus the pension more on older pensioners, but you want something at 65 so you can do a bit of work, have a bit of pension and have a much more phased process into retirement. That's what people want.
What do you think about raising the retirement age?
Well, there isn't a retirement age, there's a pension age, and there is no requirement that people stop working when they take the pension. We got rid of that. And this is where we made common cause with the Liberal Democrats. My view, and Frank Field's view, and Steve's view was that if there's extra money going, it should go to the older pensioners, which is where there is the poverty, not for the 65-year-olds, but for the 75 or 80-year-olds. But that you could keep the structure of the basic pension and then try to encourage the people in their 50s into work. Only 1/3 of men aged 60 to 65 are in full-time work. The real challenge is to get people working until the age of 65, rather than an academic debate about getting them working from the ages of 65 to 75.
Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. Now, Britain is harbouring someone described in the American courts as a notorious terrorist. So far, the furthest the authorities have got to containing Abu Hamza has been for the charity commissioners to tell him that he might be removed from his position at Finsbury Park Mosque next month. They say he's made extreme and political statements there. Others go much further. Abu Hamza, they claim, is a godfather of terrorism, not merely encouraging and giving moral succor to violence, but of being intimately involved too, to say nothing of preaching religious hatred. I'll be talking to him shortly. First, Peter Marshall has this assessment.
They can advise, they can suggest, they can tell you, look, it's going to cause problem.
This is Abu Hamza giving his followers the word. He's been asked for his view of bank robberies. He says banks are Jewish institutions and therefore satanic, so it is indeed okay to rob them.
For example, people ask me about France and this and that. I say, go and do it. You know, not only banks, post office as well, and don't leave anything. Just go over, take, shoot and loot.
Some of Abu Hamza's flock are now known throughout the world as international terrorists. There's Richard Reed, raised in South London, the shoe bomber who tried to blow up a transatlantic airliner. From Croydon, there's Feroz Abbasi, now locked up in Guantanamo Bay. From France, there's Zacharias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker arrested before the attacks on America. And there are others, enough to leave the Americans at least convinced that Abu Hamza is what they call a central and key enemy in their war on terrorism.
Hamza is not only a recruiter, he is an inciter, he is a developer, and he is at the crux in London of many of the terrorists that have come after the United States, and I think England, London particularly, ought to be concerned that he is still in their midst.
This is Abu Hamza's base, the North London Central Mosque at Finsbury Park. It's where he recently warned that Tony Blair and other politicians could be the target of revenge attacks by Western Muslims, converts. In Abu Hamza's words, they don't take as much crap as immigrants like himself. The Americans are eager to get their hands on Abu Hamza, and they can join the club. The French have been after him for years, as has the government of Yemen. So security authorities on 3 continents now say that Abu Hamza's presence here at Finsbury Park is crucial to the terrorist network. But if he is what they say he is, that central figure, how has he been getting away with it for so long, and for how long can he go on? It's a piece Margaret, his wife of 30 years, loved to hear him play. But Lawrence Whitehouse has been a widower now for 4 years, ever since their fateful holiday to Yemen when they were taken hostage by anti-government guerrillas. Margaret and 3 other tourists were killed after being used as human shields by the kidnappers. Lawrence saw it all and remembers the previous night when the kidnappers' leader spoke by phone to London, to Abu Hamza, a man he says has questions to answer.
I asked him what his role specifically was. Did he want tourists taken hostage? When we were taken hostage, what did he ask Abu Hassan to do with us, and why, and for how long? And would he have regarded it as being justifiable to kill us in exchange for the prisoners held in the Aden prison?
Those prisoners held in Aden, claiming they were tortured, included Abu Hamza's son and, here in court on the right, his stepson.
I've been sexually abused. They've been saying that we're going to shoot you and we're going to save you.
He's still serving a 5-year sentence for plotting to blow up the British embassy and a hotel. They all denied the plot, as did the man Yemen says was behind it, Abu Hamza. Abu Hamza's influence on his own family and acolytes can only be guessed at, but others who've seen him at close quarters say it's devastating.
Abu Hamza will eat your mind.
Eat your mind?
He will eat it. I mean, you have, to be very, very careful, because some people, such Richard Reed or Abbasi, or there is plenty of others which they don't speak Arabic, and they had to sit next to him, and they become vulnerable because he does use, some very, very powerful words, and he does open door for other people who are specialized in for the jihad, which is physical.
In August 1998, more than 250 people were killed in bomb attacks on US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. At a private meeting just 72 hours later, Abu Hamza was asked his view of bombing embassies in Muslim lands. Pictures of that meeting, never before shown on television, have been acquired by Newsnight. Throughout, Abu Hamza refers to non-Muslims as kafirs, non-believers.
Muslim lands or non-Muslim lands, the same thing. Number one, why if Muslims are having a war against these people, then yes, it's illegitimate. Or if these people are... You see the Islamic rule, if a kafir goes into a Muslim country and he's walking by, he's like a cow going, anybody could take him. Kafir is walking by, he went inside, you catch him, what are you doing here? Then he's a boot, you can sell him the market. This is what Islam says. They have to have a peace treaty before they come. But if they come with their weapons and they come with their thing against Islamic rules, or being protected by an apostate leader, or coming to a country which does not apply Islam, then what are they doing there anyway? Most of them are spies and things like that. Even if they don't do anything, if Muslims cannot take them to and sell them in the market, then you just kill them. It's okay. And don't leave anything. Just go home.
We played that tape and others of Abu Hamza's preachings to the former High Court judge, Sir Michael Davis. We asked him how Abu Hamza could push an inflammatory message and escape prosecution.
I don't think the question is, has he broken the law? Probably he has. The question is, can it be, before he's prosecuted, is it possible to prove that he has? And there are some nasty holes in any potential case. There's no positive evidence that he's been a member of a prescribed group, no positive evidence that he's indulged in violence himself, no positive evidence that he has done damage to property. It's a lot of talk.
But he speaks in favour of the bombing of embassies. He says that can be okay. And he talks about shooting and looting. He supports that too.
I think he knows exactly what he's saying, and I think he's gauged in his own mind exactly how far he can go without being prosecuted.
Surprisingly, perhaps, there's no law against inciting religious hatred. And according to the former judge, such as the current climate, the DPP would be reluctant to launch a terrorism prosecution without a 95% certainty of conviction. So the Americans, furious Abu Hamza's still free, are trying to build a case of their own against him. They're convinced he's most vulnerable via his closest followers.
Do not compare these to Islamic rising, that they steal from you when they assassinate your leaders and they take your land and help select new rulers over you.
This is James Ujama, one of Abu Hamza's trusted acolytes. After 3 years in London, Ujama moved back to the US. The Americans have now charged James Ujama with a terrorist conspiracy. The prosecution is a means to an end. Its chief target is Abu Hamza.
He is indeed a target because he has made the United States a target of terrorism.
Victoria Tunsing is a lawyer who spent years running terrorism cases in the US Justice Department. She's extremely well informed about Abu Hamza, and while the department will allow no official comment, she faces no such constraints.
This is the usual procedure in United States prosecutions. Many times, whether it be a drug case or Enron or terrorism, we'll work with the lower downs, the sergeants and lieutenants, in order to get them to either agree to testify or, if convicted, to force them to testify against the higher-ups, the colonels and generals. I would look at Hamza as certainly a general in the organization.
According to US prosecutors, Abu Hamza was the sponsor for James Ujama's trip to Afghan training camps and was behind a plot to set up terrorist training camps inside the US at land in Bly, Oregon. According to the indictment, Ujama was assisted at various stages by other followers of Abu Hamza. They include Usama Kassir, who's a Swede, and the young man from Croydon, Feroz Abbasi, who's been interrogated in Guantanamo Bay.
Here's what will happen in the United States. Ujama, who has already been charged, will have to either agree to testify against Hamza, or he will be convicted, and if convicted, he no longer has any Fifth Amendment privilege, so he can be forced to testify against Hamza.
If I were the Director of Public Prosecutions or running the Crown Prosecution Service in connection with this matter, I'd say, God bless the Americans. If you do it, we shall be delighted and we hope you're successful. But then I'd take the person I was speaking to, the American, aside and say, but watch it, boy, don't fall on your face and make a mess of it.
I know people who leave, they go somewhere else, far from their houses to other capital area where they can loot.
If the Americans fail to silence Abu Hamza, we can expect him to continue pressing young followers to fight jihad, to seek it out wherever it may be. In one of the tapes, he spoke of a hierarchy, a pecking order of Islam's enemies.
Look, they are all pigs. They are all enemies of Islam. But those who jump the queue and try to become the biggest enemy and the big boys against Islam, those are the people who need to be humiliated more, and those are the people who should be having the slaps in their faces and their backsides as well, and we couldn't care less.
That was 4 years ago. With Britain now a mainstay of what he's termed the American Jewish Christian Crusaders, one wonders if today he'd suggest that of those nations to be slapped or targeted, he's now moved Britain to the top of the list.
I think that maybe there are political considerations that because he is an imam in a mosque, maybe the British government is afraid to act. I don't know. You'll have to ask them. But it just amazes me, with so much evidence that we have and the ability to connect him with a person here in the United States with an actual violation of U.S. law, that the UK doesn't have something that he violated.
In the word according to Abu Hamza, millions of human beings are likened to pigs or cows, there to be slaughtered. It's the type of thinking that led to the death of Margaret Whitehouse, a good woman who'd have abhorred such views.
She would have regarded him much the same way as myself, deluded, misguided. People never succeed in justifying a course of action that involves methods that are inhuman. Each person has a role in life and a part to play. And my wife's role as a teacher of infants was substantially more valuable than the role that he will ever play.
Well, Abu Hamza joins us now in the studio. I have some very simple questions for you, which you can answer very briefly. Firstly, do you still believe it is right to loot and shoot in banks?
Well, when you talk about loot and shoot, it's not against nations. It is against those who deprive our people from the right, steal their money, and indulge them into difficulties.
So the answer to the question is yes, you do.
Let me finish, please. None of these statements which you have exposed or said is against you people, because our war and struggle is against governments, institutions like banks, and also armies who are heavy-handed.
The answer to the question, which is capable of a simple yes or no, is yes, you do think it is legitimate still to shoot and loot in banks.
Well, the banks are a different story. Banks are imposing us in poverty.
The piece of tape we saw you talking about was banks.
Listen, not all sort of banks. Banks who are actually indulging people into usury and taking the property and putting the international money fund in a way that's basically slaving Africa and slaving our countries.
That was specifically banks in France you were talking about. You used the words it's okay to loot and shoot in banks in France.
Look what France have done into Algeria. Look at what France have done in North Africa.
Thank you.
And that was the question.
You answered the question. Right. The next question is, if it is legitimate in France, is it legitimate in this country?
Well, it's not. Maybe it's not legitimate for people, for everybody. But the question was from somebody who is Algerian, whose family being killed, and the property is being taken. And if somebody is similar to him in England, then he has the right to do so. Islam doesn't say you turn the other cheek for your aggressors, but basically you defend yourself in an appropriate way.
Do you still believe it is legitimate to blow up embassies in foreign countries, killing?
Well,
in that case, you're talking about 200 people.
Please, you are only showing a shred of the whole picture.
We have 8 hours of it.
No, please. These embassies have been blown up as a result of snatching Islamists in Albania all over the world, and basically they've been used as a spy place.
As you know, we are talking about who died in Kenya were in fact Kenyans.
If you are using people as shields for yourselves, and you're not using your embassy as everybody else civilian using his embassy basically to do and serve their own civilians, then basically, like you hate the civilians in Iraq, and you said it's because of Saddam they paying these policies. So Islamists who are trying to defend themselves from you and the tyrants who actually propped by you, they have no other choice.
Why do you keep on talking about Islam justifying this kind of behavior when, as you well know, the majority of Muslim organizations in this country won't let you anywhere near their mosques?
Well, who said I want to go near their mosques? I'm not looking for the quantity, I'm looking for the quality, number one.
Are you seriously claiming you speak for most Muslims in this country?
Well, I'm giving quotations. I'm not saying I'm speaking for most Muslims. I'm speaking for the sincere Muslims, the Muslims who have been humiliated because of your policies, and the Muslims who do appreciate the hard work of your nation, defending the Iraqi national, defending the Palestinians. I mean, we do appreciate the work of your nation, defending and demonstrating to defend our people.
But you legitimize murder.
Never against the people of your country who are actually going out of their houses at night to protect the Iraqi blood and to protect the Palestinian against genocide. It's against your evil policy makers.
Tell us?
It's against your banking who are making globalization.
What you say to Mr. Lawrence Whitehouse, the widower whose wife was murdered in Yemen as a consequence of hostage taking?
Yeah, but listen, this man has a misfortune which everybody, of course, he will reject. But the problem is, again, you are only showing a part of the picture. The other picture, if you want to be just, put next to him a Palestinian who lost all his family sleeping at his house, And we are all one nation. You are trying to say a tourist who knows what's going on in Yemen, and before he went there, so many people have been snatched in Yemen and kidnapped. And I warned before he was getting 7 months ago, 7 months before he went to Yemen, I was warning, please,
you were
nobody...
in direct contact with the people who took them hostage?
No, I was not. They phoned me because I was really acting as a mouthpiece for Islamists who are working in the Middle East. And these people have issued a warning. Please let me finish. 7 months before this kidnapping happened. And when they phoned, they were actually phoning how to release them in an honorable way, but the government intervened, and suddenly...
That again is also not your fault. Is there any government in the world you admire, Mr. Abu Hamza?
Yeah, Taliban.
Well, they're not the government anymore. Is there any other apart from them?
The coming Taliban.
The coming Taliban in Afghanistan?
Hopefully, inshallah. This is what I admire, because we are living here on earth not to enjoy ourselves. We should ensure our return to God, honorable return to God. And the definition of right and wrong, it comes from God, not from politicians. So basically, why you are so keen to stop me from preaching? I mean, why, if there is a law in this country, so why you raise this point? If you read today,
Mr. Abu Hamza, no one is trying to stop you preaching.
Now, please, the Daily Express today, second page, under the title of the American setup for dirty plot against preachers, they say they're going to bribe journalists to make Abu Hamza's life difficult. And so there is this lady from America who is actually accusing me everything. She is also a part of the plot. I hope you're not a part of it as well.
If it's so detestable here, why don't you go and live somewhere else?
Well, I hope so, but I'm just stuck like somebody who's stuck in a toilet and there's a minefield outside.
Mr. Abu Hamza, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, now, United Nations weapons inspectors were all over various bits of Baghdad University today, searching for evidence of Saddam Hussein's weapons program. Thus far, they seem to have found nothing to contradict Iraq's claim not to have any weapons of mass destruction. With the Americans sounding hugely sceptical, preparations for war seem to roll on. The Ministry of Defense revealed today that a task force is being put together for possible combat. Ships are being hired, reservists are being warned of possible call-up, and tanks being adapted for desert use. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is here. Mark, is this a serious deployment that's being contemplated, or another kind of political fig leaf for the Americans?
Well, I'm glad you said contemplated, because it's not yet a serious deployment at all. There is no order yet. Defence officials were absolutely plain about that today, to send a force to the Gulf for the purpose of enforcing the UN resolution in question. What has happened is that they have started spending money. They have put out approaches to the shipping industry to start doing the sort of things in terms of lifting troops out, converting tanks, some of the other things you mentioned there in the introduction, that would put Britain in a position to deploy a force to the Gulf at some point in the near future, if the political decision was taken so to do.
What's the timetable then?
Well, the question which is most peculiar about all this is people today in Whitehall were talking about making the threats credible towards Iraq. And one really thinks that the sort of steps that are being taken ought to have been done long ago, as indeed they have been by the Americans. In order to do that, we really are behind the loop here. If you, for example, were to order the British Army to send an armoured brigade to Kuwait tomorrow or the day after, in the very near future, the first elements would probably leave the country on about the 1st of January, and we know it would take 2.5 months to deploy a large brigade or small division, several thousand troops with several hundred armoured vehicles. Now that means the 15th of March before they're in Kuwait and ready to go. If you want to cut a bit of slack for acclimatisation, training, all the rest of it, you're probably talking 1st of April before they're really ready to cross the start line, as it were. Hopefully not a particularly significant date. Now, if we look, on the other hand, at the Americans' timetable, a lot of people in Washington talking about trying to bring matters to a head in February or early March. The Brits simply don't fit in with that, which leaves on with the conclusions that some of the American Pentagon officials who've been talking about quite a limited British contribution on the Afghan model, special forces, some aircraft, may well be right about the war-fighting phase, and a deployment such as this one we've just been talking about may be, as in the Balkans and Afghanistan, something to do with the post-hot war phase. In other words, we couldn't get there in time for the current timetabled American military operations.
Now, there was also an announcement, a rather intriguing announcement, which I hope you noticed, I expect you did notice, about nuclear missile defence today, and an apparent request being made to the British about Fylingdales and Menwith Hill and so on.
Yes, President Bush announced today that he's going to press on with deployment of what they're calling a limited missile shield. This is very limited. They're talking about 10 interceptor missiles in Alaska by the end of 2004. Now, when he came into office, he seemed to be putting the brakes on this project on the grounds that the technology really wasn't ripe. He talked about the need for more testing. He's saying today that because of the events of September the 11th, and various other developments, for example with North Korea, he now wants to bring forward that capability. A potentially tricky question for Tony Blair, particularly with the left of the Labour Party, long opposed to British participation, but it would seem that we are set to cooperate with that plan.
Mark Urban, thank you. Tomorrow's newspaper's coming up shortly. Before that, though, a roundup of today's news. Our main story tonight, the government has defended its proposed reforms of the pension system. Work and Pension Secretary Andrew Smith told this programme that plans to scrap compulsory retirement ages and simplify tax and savings schemes would encourage people to work for longer and to save more. The parents of 2 young people dying from the human form of mad cow disease can go ahead with controversial treatment, a High Court judge ruled today. The therapy, untried in humans, means injecting a drug usually aimed at urinary infections directly into the brains of the teenagers. Now, as our science editor Susan Watts reports, the Department of Health is trying to find a hospital prepared to carry out the operation.
18-year-old Jonathan Sims was diagnosed a year ago with the human form of BSE, or variant CJD. Then he was a bright, energetic student. Now he communicates by squeezing his family's hands. They believe injections with the drug pentazan polysulfate are their last hope of prolonging his life. There's no cure for VCJD, and the average life expectancy once symptoms appear is just 14 months. After protracted legal wrangling, Jonathan's father said today both his son and the second